The Battle of Hel Fenn took place in the year 2142 and was the final battle of the Third Vampire War, during which Mannfred's dread legions of undead terrorized the Empire, bringing death and destruction in equal measure. After Conrad von Carstein died in the Second Vampire War, Mannfred became the undisputed ruler of Sylvania. For a decade, he let the various contenders to the imperial throne think the vampire threat was over. But in truth, Mannfred von Carstein desired the throne to himself. Where his sire, Vlad, had ruled through his iron will and raw power, and Conrad through fear, Mannfred von Carstein used his necromantic prowess and devious manipulations to forge his armies. Through guile, flattery, and intimidation, Mannfred sought out vampires from across the Empire and spent the intervening months rousing restless spirits and rites from decrepit tombs. When civil war finally racked the Empire once more, Mannfred deemed the time was right to strike. Mannfred von Carstein's undead legions crossed the Sylvanian border in the winter, marching through the snow towards Altdorf, capital of the Empire. Uncaring of the frigid cold, they slew any living being they came across, including all opposition sent to stop them. Dark rumours of Mannfred's coming was enough to send villagers fleeing from their homes, only for them to freeze to death in the snow, their corpses only to be added to the growing, unliving army. Upon reaching the capital of Altdorf, Mannfred found the city seemingly abandoned, much to his satisfaction, and marched to claim his prize. Mannfred was only stopped when the Grand Theognist Kurt III appeared on the battlements, bringing forth the Liber Mortis as he began to recite a great spell from its pages. Immediately, the effects could be felt across the battlefield. Mannfred's control over his minions began to weaken, as the winds of magic slipped from his grasp and the warriors crumbled to dust. Mannfred ordered a hasty retreat. With Altdorf beyond his grasp for the time being, he set out to besiege Marienburg instead. Shortly after beginning the siege of Marienburg, his scouts reported that an army had set out from Altdorf and was coming up fast behind him. He was forced to abandon the siege and so begin a lengthy chase of cat and mouse, as Mannfred retreated across the Empire, pursued by the unifying armies of the Empire, as well as a dwarfen expedition sent by the High King to help ensure Mannfred's permanent death. During this time, neither army would know the exact position of their enemy, but in time, they were all led deep into Sylvania. Knowing it was only a matter of time before he was brought to battle, Mannfred made one last gambit to destroy the now combined forces on his tail. He marched his army into the marshes of Hel Fenn, drawing his enemies into a trap. In ages past, the tribes of men used to bury their dead in the swampland located east of Sylvania, a goldmine of corpses that Mannfred could use as his minions. It was at Hel Fenn that Mannfred had decided to make his last stand. Even as the Imperial army trudged through the mire, grasping hands from the chill waters dragged soldiers to their doom. While at night, sentries were lured to their deaths by flickering ghost lights. Fully a quarter of the Empire's pursuing army died in Hel Fenn before they even saw battle. But they persisted and managed to get into position. The living men watched with growing concern as more and more of Mannfred's warriors slunk their way out of the forest and began to form into regiments in complete silence. No order was shouted, no trumpet bayed. Mannfred had good reason to be confident. His army outnumbered the Empire army facing him, and the dwarfs were still some distance away. Knowing it would be harder to face both armies together, he decided to attack quickly. Dawn broke, cold and grey. The Battle of Hel Fenn was about to begin. Mannfred attacked the right flank of the Empire's army first, attempting to seize their position. But the Empire's Black Guard were protecting that flank. Standing in the tight ranks, the Imperial defenders endured even as wave after wave of horrors washed upon their defences. Within minutes, the men were knee-deep in a twitching mound of their body parts, for the unliving were relentless in their pursuit and would fill the voids left by their incapacitated comrades. For each blackguard that fell, at least 24 of the dead perished alongside him. In grim silence they counted their bloody work and held the line. Messengers soon brought word that the dwarfen allies had arrived. They had marched day and night to reach the battle and would relieve the Empire's left flank. With his reserves depleting and the dwarfs fast approaching, Mannfred was left no choice but to march his army up the centre. The undead army moving across the field was vast. Blocks of skeletons marched in perfect unison, 1,000 strong. A detachment of spearmen and crossbowmen from the Empire marched forth in an attempt to hold the upcoming horde. The spearmen were only a few ranks deep, and they faced skeleton and zombie regiments in numbers uncountable. Their orders were to hold the undead as long as possible. This thin line was dubbed the Forlorn Hope. Surprisingly, and against the odds, they managed to hold the line. Until Suddenly, Mannfred decided to tip the balance and the undead turned and marched away, leaving the forlorn hope to cheer their victory. But from the bulk of the retreating hordes of undead, Mannfred appeared, leading a charge of black knights, riding undead steeds and fast moving towards the still celebrating soldiers. Martin, the Count of Stirland, raised his sword in the air. "Cavalry!" he cried, and the trumpets called the muster. Heavy cavalry advanced from their position in the rear. Hundreds of knights trotted past the cheering infantry. It was the Empire's counter-charge. The ground shook. The Empire's cavalry seemed unstoppable, courageous and deadly. Mannfred saw this move and turned his steed, leaving his knights to their fate. The wave of steel clashed onto the Black Knights with such force that it resounded from their entire swamp, and the undead cavalry was utterly destroyed. This is where it should have ended. However, General Jaeger, who was leading the charge, with his blood boiling in victory and on a quest for personal glory, continued the charge, chasing the undead away deep into the enemy lines. When he realised his mistake, he was already surrounded by skeleton spearmen that blocked their way out. Out of the 600 riders that had led the initial glorious charge, barely 100 managed to return back to the Allied lines. The rest died, surrounded and slashed into the mud, including General Jaeger. The undead army began to advance once again over the main field. On the flanks, it featured skeletal cavalry and dire wolves. The Empire held the second force of knights of the Divine Sword, led by the Grand Theogenist himself all the way from Altdorf. The Empire's cavalry engaged with the dire wolves, which eventually fled from the field. On the ridge, the Empire deployed their infantry, mostly veteran swordsmen and halberders. Their task was crucial. They were to take the brunt of the undead attack. And as they fought, to retreat step by step, keeping the line together while drawing Mannfred's forces forward deeper into the Empire's lines. When the vampire army started to gain ground in the centre, Mannfred saw this apparent weakness and committed more undead to the centre to increase the pressure. When the undead had been drawn into the marshy lowlands, trumpets sounded from the Empire soldiers. The heavy infantry and skirmishers poured out from behind the Empire lines, attacking the skeletons at the flanks. The dwarves joined and pushed towards the centre. Also, the cavalry, who had recently finished slaughtering Mannfred's dire wolves, crashed into the skeleton's rear. What followed was a slaughter, and such a word that can be used to describe the slaying of the already dead. The undead were hemmed in from all sides. Mannfred saw that he'd been duped by allowing his army to be drawn into a trap, and managed to escape. But after a furious chase, Count Martin engaged him in a duel. Mannfred, exhausted from the battle and with his powers depleted from controlling such a vast undead army, was struck down by the Elector Count's runefang. His body sank into the mud, only to never be found again. Following his great victory, the Elector Count Martin of Stirland was proclaimed a hero of the Empire. He lived out the rest of his years a well-respected Elector Count, and the tactics he used to defeat Mannfred are still studied to this day in all military schools.
Thank you for watching. On this channel, we're putting together fan-made cinematic episodes featuring historical and fantasy battles based on the settings from the Total War series and, of course, good old World of Warhammer. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and hit the notification button to be the first to watch the next battle.